The McCann Troll. Hello, I'm H.G. Tudor. Many of you will be very much aware of the disappearance of Madeline McCann. Madeline Beth McCann, who was born on the 12th of May 2003, is a British missing person who disappeared from her bed in a holiday department at Praia da Luz in Portugal on the evening of the 3rd of May 2007 at the age of 3. The Daily Telegraph has described the disappearance as the most heavily reported missing person case in modern history. Her whereabouts remain unknown, although German prosecutors believe that she is dead. Madeline was on holiday from the United Kingdom with her parents, Kate and Jerry McCann, her 2-year-old twin siblings, and a group of family friends and their children. The McCann children had been left asleep at 20:30 in the ground floor apartment, while their parents dined with friends in a restaurant 180 feet away. The parents checked on the children throughout the evening, until Kate McCann discovered Madeline was missing at 10 o'clock. Over the following weeks, particularly after misinterpreting a British DNA analysis, the Portuguese police came to believe that Madeline had died in an accident in the apartment and that her parents had covered it up. The McCanns were given suspect status in September 2007, which was lifted when Portugal's Attorney General archived the case in July 2008 for lack of evidence. Madeline's parents continued the investigation using private detectives until Scotland Yard opened its own inquiry, Operation Grange, in 2011. The senior investigating officer announced that he was treating the disappearance as a criminal act by a stranger, most likely a planned abduction or burglary gone wrong. In 2013, Scotland Yard issued EFIT images of men they wanted to trace, including one of a man seen carrying a child towards the beach on the night Madeline vanished. Shortly after this, Portuguese police reopened their inquiry. Operation Grange was scaled back in 2015, but the remaining detectives continued to pursue a small number of inquiries, described in April 2017 as significant. In 2020, police in the German city of Braunschweig stated there was a new suspect in Madeline's disappearance, whom public prosecutor Hans Christian Wolters was convinced had abducted and murdered the child. Madeline's disappearance attracted sustained international interest and saturation coverage in the United Kingdom, reminiscent of the death of Princess Diana in 1997. Her parents were subjected to intense scrutiny and allegations of involvement in their daughter's death, particularly in the tabloid press and on Twitter. In 2008, they and their travelling companions received damages and apologies from Express newspapers, and in 2011, the McCanns testified before the Leveson inquiry into British press misconduct, lending support to those arguing for tighter press regulation. There are those that believe that Madeline McCann was abducted and remains alive. Indeed, recently, there was a young lady suggesting that she believes that she was Madeline McCann. There are those that believe that she's dead, that as a consequence of being abducted by persons unknown. There are others who believe that her parents caused her death, albeit accidentally, with a consequence that they then covered it up and fabricated a suggestion that she had been abducted. There are repeated theories, hypotheses as to what has gone on, with so much scrutiny of the McCanns creating a wealth of information. There are many people who believe they are innocent and that they are grieving the loss of their daughter, who they foolishly didn't look after properly, by having her remain in a place which was separate from where they were dining. There are others who have little sympathy for them as a consequence of that. There are others that believe that they are instrumental in her death and actually caused it. You can find a wealth of information across the internet. There are those, of course, who maintain that if this had happened to a working class child, or a child of a working class couple, there would never have been the level of scrutiny or consideration or assistance that has been provided. And instead, because they're dealing with two white middle class parents who are physicians, that they received unfair preferential treatment. Some people had a particular distaste for the McCanns, and one of those individuals was a lady called Brenda Leyland. and she was one of the many trolls that the McCanns experienced. I've explained to you in a separate video about the online troll the nature and substance of what trolls are, and I'd advise you to watch that to gain an understanding. But here, there's an interesting article where the son of a particularly virulent troll, who actually ended up taking her own life, talks about his mother's life, which provides us with an interesting insight into what she was. The article is written by Simon Hattonstone in the Guardian newspaper and is headlined, "My Mother the Troll. I think she lost sight of the McCann's humanity." There was this entire part of Mum that I never knew about, Ben Leyland says. Brenda Leyland was a stylish, well-spoken and rather private woman who lived in a picturesque village in Leicestershire. He knew she told stories, grandiosity, delusion, and that some of them may have been on the tall side. He also knew that she spent a lot of time on her laptop and was increasingly living online, potentially virtual fuel matrix. What he didn't know was that his mother had become a Twitter troll who spent the final years of her life relentlessly attacking the parents of Madeline McCann, smearing, assertion of control, sense of entitlement, the girl who disappeared in Portugal in 2007 at the age of 3 and hasn't been seen since. In 2014, Brenda was approached by a Sky News journalist who asked her why she was trolling McCanns on Twitter. She was about to get into a car with her friend to visit a garden centre and declined to comment. Assertion of control by going into a position of withdrawal, silent treatment. The journalist then told her that she had been reported to Scotland Yard and her tweets were being investigated as part of a larger campaign of abuse against the McCanns. "Well, that's fair enough," she said calmly. But Brenda's face gave her away. Her eyes blinked and her cheek twitched anxiously. Perhaps this was a manifestation of the threat to control posed by being told that she was investigated. 4 days later, on the 4th of October 2014, Brenda killed herself. Might this have been the ultimate method of nullifying a threat to control? Her trolling and subsequent suicide resulted in a number of newspaper stories about the toxic culture of Twitter, the danger of people hiding behind avatars and fake names on social media, the biliousness of Brenda's attack on the McCanns, and the tragedy of her death. What could have led a woman to post hundreds of tweets attacking a couple she had never met? And why did she think there was nothing left to live for when she was caught out? Well, it might be that she was posting all of those tweets because they posed a threat to control and she developed an obsession about them. It might be that she was attacking a couple she never met because she had no emotional empathy for them and she had a sense of entitlement to behave that way. It may also be that she was relishing the response of other people to her attacks because that was fuel. In terms of why did she think there was nothing left to live for when she was caught out? Well, although it's unusual for narcissists to commit suicide, it can happen, and in some instances, it is the ultimate method of nullifying a threat to control by ultimate withdrawal, taking one's life. Possibly, it might have been that. Ben, 38, has not talked to a newspaper about his mother before, but nearly a decade on, he believes there are lessons to be learned from her story. Lessons that have been crucial to his own survival. Ben, who graduated from Oxford University with a degree in theology, is a recovering drug addict who now works as a life coach in Los Angeles for people with mental health and addiction problems. Although he recognises there was much he didn't know about his mother, in other ways they were painfully close. When she died, she took me out too, he says. It was a suicide bomb. I never had a separate identity from Mum. That observation in itself speaks considerable volumes, that the son doesn't see that he was separate from his mother, namely, she made him an extension of him. Over the past 7 years, he has done detective work, trying to piece together Brenda's life. Only by understanding her has he been able to understand himself, he says. But it's not been easy. So much of her life was a fiction, and he's still trying to disentangle the truth from the make-believe. After Brenda's death, Ben gave up his job and devoted himself to his own destruction. He'd been working in corporate law for 7 years, and the wealth he had accrued, along with the money he received after his mother's death, meant he could afford not to work for a few years. I was in grief, but numbing myself with drugs and alcohol. I was like, I'm done. I'm just going to quit the world for a while, eat out for breakfast, lunch and dinner, and do enough cocaine to kill a small village, he pauses. Or maybe a large village, frankly. And I just kept going. When the money ran out, he turned to crystal meth. That was when Ben reached his nadir. Brenda Leyland, who was 63 when she died, grew up in a military family in Albright in Shropshire. She went to convent school and briefly worked in marketing. When she met her future husband and Ben's father in the 1970s, she told her parents that he didn't make much money and she was bringing home the bacon. Lie, revision of history, grandiosity, smearing. In fact, he was doing very well for himself. A working-class boy, he had grown up in Birmingham and qualified as an accountant. He later went on to develop an assisted living complex for elderly people, which he sold at a profit. The reality was that Brenda had expensive tastes, sense of entitlement, and was in debt, financially haphazard, lack of accountability, and her husband frequently had to help her out of her financial difficulties, lack of accountability and responsibility for her own behaviours. Brenda was famous in the family for her stories. There were so many of them that Ben doesn't know where to start. One that she liked to dine out on was how she had known Elton John when he was a teenager called Reggie Dwight. She would tell us how she was living on an army barracks when her dad was in the RAF and Reggie lived next door. She said he was besotted with her school friend and came across to our house to give her love letters for her friend, only to be confronted by my handlebarred mustachioed grandfather, who scared the living daylights out of a young Reggie. Mum had this theory that maybe those early experiences made him gay. It was only when we watched that movie Rocket Man about Elton John that me and my dad were like, really? Delusion, told stories, sense of entitlement, lack of accountability for behaviour, triangulation. Rocket Man came out in 2019, 5 years after Brenda's death. By then, Ben was suspicious about many of the stories she had told him. The thing is, he says his mother's stories were so colourful that he wanted to believe them, even if he had his doubts. Take the tale about her father. She would have you believe that he was involved in more missions than anybody else in the RAF. She had these stories about how he got shot down over Crete and ended up crash landing and living with the Crete resistance in a cave, subsisting on nothing more than Worcestershire sauce. He laughs at his own naivety as much as anything. She said he got the Victoria Cross, but he didn't. Lie, fantasy, revision of history, triangulation. She sounds as if she had an amazing imagination, I say. She had a Lewis Carroll Jabberwockian level of madness and eccentricity, Ben says, adding that they shared a vivid interior life. When there's been serious trauma, sometimes people retreat into their imagination. But Ben was never sure about the nature of the trauma at the heart of Brenda's life. She would say that her brother had been abused by a Catholic priest, and that had affected her badly. Possibly true, resulting to a lack of control environment, possibly a revision of history by way of triangulation and smearing. There were also periods in her life when she went away to get better. She never talked about what she was in hospital for, but she would come home regaling him with stories about the rich and famous people she had met there. Grandiosity, fantasy, revision of history, triangulation. From the outside, the Leylands looked like a happy, high-achieving nuclear family. Ben's father was a successful businessman. They lived in the biggest house on the block, and both Ben and his brother were sent to private schools. They went on holidays to the Caribbean, and Brenda was indulged. She spent a lot of time buying clothes and at makeup counters. She liked the fine life. Vanity, expensive tastes. Then, when Ben was 12, the family fell apart. His father left Brenda for another woman, to whom he is still happily married. His brother, then 19, had recently left home, so Brenda and Ben moved to a rented property in Burton Overy, a village in Leicestershire. Brenda transformed their new home. It was a shit show when we moved in, but she transformed it into something special, Ben says. Brenda renovated the place, turning it into a classic English country cottage. There were brass and copper utensils hanging on the wall in the kitchen. She painted and aged standard pine dresses and wardrobes so they looked like antique French furniture. She liked the challenge. Maybe part of her had to keep up with the Joneses. She found a good way of making cheap things look expensive, which has a certain metaphorical value, because she always wanted you to think she was someone other than who she was. Suggestion of false self. She was terrified that if you knew the real her, you wouldn't like her. Facade management. Who did she think the real Brenda Leyland was? A girl who didn't get an education, a woman who hardly ever worked, who didn't do the thing she thought she deserved to do or was destined for, whose mummy and daddy didn't like her very much, Ben says. That may well hint to a lack of control environment for Brenda in her childhood. She wanted people to see her as this elegant, insightful, articulate person, maybe with an element of mystery. She wanted people to pay attention, provision of fuel, and speak of her when she wasn't there and say, "My God, that Brenda Leyland, she can spin a yarn and see through to the core of what's going on." Interestingly, demonstrative, of course, of the necessity of the requirement of fuel delusions of grandeur. And did people think that? I thought that to a certain extent. He compares her to Anna Sorokin, the Russian fake heiress who conned her way into New York high society as Anna Delvey, before being jailed for fraud in 2019. In many ways, Ben says, Mum was wonderful. She was beautiful, intelligent, funny. She had a good way with one-liners. I remember when hand soap got fancy with things like Molton Brown, and she'd be like, "Smell my hands, I've just been to the toilet." We knew what she was referring to, but there was this double entendre. She had an acerbic wit. Brenda adored her younger son. She took an enormous amount of pride in me, Ben says. She dined out on my Oxford education, character trait acquisition. But there was a downside. She was possessive, ownership, demanding of his attention, fuel, and constantly gave him the impression that he had failed her, devaluing behaviours. She wouldn't tell him he didn't spend enough time with her. She would tell him he didn't spend enough time with her, devaluing behaviour, lack of emotional empathy. Didn't think about her enough, lack of emotional empathy. Didn't love her, pity play. You could always tell she was keeping a scorecard. I was treading on eggshells around her, for fear I might say the wrong thing. Common explanation that's put forward, of course, by a victim of a narcissist. There were things you thought she'd dealt with that she still held on to, grudges and resentments like, "You don't come home for Christmas," "You forgot Mother's Day," triangulation, bringing up the past. Ben says Brenda cost him his relationship with his brother and father. Isolation, alienation. She made him choose between her and them, absence of emotional empathy. He became her life, and Ben found it oppressive. Not least because he was dealing with his own problems. By the age of 16, he was taking cocaine and drinking too much. He knew he was gay but couldn't come to terms with it. He was a child of the 90s and homophobia was rife. I remember Stephen Gately of Boyzone being smoked out of the closet and the coverage in newspapers about all these betrayed female fans, Ben says. I saw George Michael getting dragged through the mud. I remember the news of Freddie Mercury dying in the coverage of HIV. There was a lot of shame about it. I remember when there was a story about David Hyde Pierce, who played Niles in Frasier, going to bathhouses in LA, and my mum saying, "That's dirty. I don't want to watch Frasier anymore." Smearing. By this time, Brenda was becoming increasingly fascinated by Madeline McCann's story. After Madeline went missing in 2007, everybody was talking about it. Brenda, who lived just 15 miles from McCann's home in Rothley, Leicestershire, was no exception. But at this point, Ben didn't think there was anything unusual in her interest in Kate and Jerry McCann. Brenda was spending a lot of time on her computer, but as far as Ben knew, she was playing card games, like solitaire. I will continue with this analysis of the McCann Troll in part 2. Join me there.